Marla Whitaker stood in the courtyard holding a box of sidewalk chalk like it was contraband, told me my kid had vandalized community property, and waved a violation notice as if it were a badge. I said that's a big word for something that disappears with the first summer rain. She smiled the way people smile when they think paper in a binder makes them taller, and right there I knew we were going to have ourselves a season. I'm Noah Rice, 44, widower, civil court mediator in Cedar Ridge, North Carolina, which is just a fancy way of saying I spend my weekdays watching grown-ups fight over fences and fees until one of them blinks. My daughter, June, is 9, and when she draws sunflowers on the sidewalk outside our townhome in Cypress Landing, she's talking to the mother she lost. The petals are never perfect, and that's how you know they're hers. Marla doesn't see any of that. Marla sees lines, bylaws, words like defacement and community standards. She runs the HOA like a private courtroom where only her gavel counts. $500, she said, tapping the red envelope against her palm. And a written apology to the board. To the board, I repeated, because sometimes you have to hear a sentence out loud just to confirm it's as ridiculous as it sounded in your head. Marla leaned in, perfume sharp, voice softer than it needed to be. People like her do that when they're getting mean. Mr. Reyes, compliance is cheaper than principle. I let that hang, looked past her at the neighbors pretending to adjust hedges and deadhead petunias while they watched, then thanked her for the envelope, walked June inside, and set the notice on the kitchen counter between a stack of homework and a bowl of peaches. I'm not a hero, not a fighter, not even especially brave. I just don't do well with bullies, and I don't like anyone turning grief into a line item. The next morning there were 2 more notices: obstruction of association authority and failure to correct, highlighted, stapled, total creeping toward $2,000 like a slow leak you can't find. People at the mail kiosk looked away the way folks look away when a patrol car lights up behind someone else, and they pretend they're invisible. I asked old Mr. Denton if he'd ever seen this before. He rubbed the back of his neck and said the Millers fought last year, ended up selling. Costs more to be right than to be quiet, he muttered, and that sentence followed me around like a stray dog all week. If you've ever lived under an HOA that confuses power with law, you know the feeling, the way your own front walk starts to feel borrowed, like you need permission to stand there. I work in courthouses. I've seen what paper can do, so I did what I do when my back tightens and my jaw won't unclench. I made coffee, opened a legal pad, and wrote down what I knew and what I didn't. What I knew: Marla was fast with fines and slow with answers. The board was mostly polite men who had learned not to argue, and the meetings at the clubhouse were always members only, which meant Marla only. What I didn't, whether any of this would hold up anywhere that matters. So I drove to the Secretary of State's office on my lunch hour, because it's public record and air-conditioned, and sometimes the truth sits in a file cabinet waiting on the right pair of eyes. A clerk pulled 3 thin folders, ran my debit card for certified copies, and pushed them across the counter with a look that said, "Whatever this is, good luck." I stood at a tall laminate table and flipped pages: articles of incorporation for Cypress Landing Community Association, annual renewals, then a gap wide enough to drive a HOA golf cart through. No renewal for the last 2 years. Not dissolved, still a set of covenants out there in the world, but no corporate standing to levy fines or file liens or swing weight around as if it were a sheriff's badge. That's a dry sentence to read on paper. It felt like thunder in my chest. Not because I had won anything yet, but because the floor under Marla's voice was hollow. She'd been operating on the sound a podium makes, not the support beams. I didn't run home and wave the papers. I've seen people win the point and lose the room. Folks don't like being told they were fooled. They like being shown there was an easier door they missed. So I took the scenic road back, drove past the lake where the geese make a mess and the kids ride bikes and parents pretend to like folding chairs, and stopped at a diner where the coffee has a burnt note that I've grown to love. I opened the certified copies, highlighted dates, scribbled a plan that wasn't really a plan so much as an order of operations, validate the documents, talk to someone inside the board if one existed, bring neighbors into a place that didn't smell like chlorine and fear, and only then, only when people were leaning forward instead of leaning back, walk this into the light. The board secretary's name is Evan Pierce, 40-ish, looks like the cleanest man in any room, and frays his cuffs in private. Found me before I found him. He caught me outside the clubhouse after a Tuesday work session. A meeting that looked from the sidewalk like three people practicing silence. Mr. Reyes, he said, not meeting my eyes, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. You're making this bigger than it is. Tell me how big it is, I said, because sometimes the shortest question is the one that opens the door. He swallowed hard, said he couldn't talk here, then called me that night from a number that doesn't exist in the directory and asked to meet at the library, the back table near municipal law, where the dust motes float like secrets in afternoon light. I arrived early. He arrived sweating, set down a slim binder like it might burn him, and whispered, I didn't sign up to be a villain. I told him villains almost never do, slid the binder closer, and let him talk because the human voice does its best work when it's uninterrupted. Minutes. Emails. Marla had called the lapse a clerical hiccup, a budget thing, and told the board to keep walking as if nothing had happened. Confidence is 9/10 of authority, she'd said in one email, which is the kind of sentence that sounds smart until you hear it next to a gavel. Evan, I said, you don't owe me anything, but the truth is heavy when you carry it alone. He nodded, eyes rimmed red, and for a second I thought he might bolt. Then he said, if you use this, don't use minute yet. I told him there's a difference between a source and a shield, and sometimes people get to be both. We met our neighbors in the church basement 3 nights later. I picked the place because it smells like floor wax and coffee and has no association logo on the wall. People trickled in with their anxiety tucked into their elbows, the Wilkinses who'd been threatened with a lien for a kayak on a porch, Mr. Denton in a pressed short-sleeve shirt, Mrs. Patel with a spiral notebook and a sharp pencil. I laid out the certified copies and let the gold seals catch light. Nobody clapped. People got quiet in that way a room gets quiet when the story they've been told goes sideways, and the new story fits in its place too clean to ignore. Marla's going to say this is technical, I said, and there's truth in that. Technicalities are where power hides. But this isn't a typo. This is the floor. Mrs. Patel leaned forward. So the fines carry the weight of the paper they're printed on, I said. Unless we let them weigh more. I could feel the mood shift, anger warming to resolve in. I kept my voice even because it's easy to break a fever and hard to guide a recovery. Evan stood in the doorway halfway through, his courage walking on new legs. He didn't come all the way in. He did say, voice small but clear, she knew. That was enough. Sometimes 3 syllables are heavier than 3 binders. We didn't storm anything. We showed up to the next town hall in good shirts with copies for anyone who asked. And when Marla started the meeting with "This is an HOA-sanctioned gathering, and I will not tolerate disruption," I raised my hand like a 5th grader and said, before we get to your agenda, I'd like to talk about whether you have one. A laugh bubbled from somewhere in the back, that kind of involuntary sound that tells you a room is ready to be honest with itself. Marla gave me her television smile. Mr. Reyes, if you've prepared remarks, you can submit them to the board. Happy to, I said, but I'd rather submit them to the members. The state shows Cypress Landing's corporate renewal lapsed 2 years ago. That means you can't fine, can't lien, can't act like you're a police precinct with potted plants. I walked the documents down the aisle the way you carry bread at church and set them on the table in front of her. You could hear the fluorescent lights breathe. You're mischaracterizing, she said, jaw tight. The Wilkinses held up their lean thread and asked if they could frame it now as art. Evan, God bless him, sat straight in his chair at the far end of the table and said into a microphone that whined, the minutes will reflect the lapse was discussed and ignored. And if you've ever watched a balloon lose air fast, you know the look that crossed Marla's face. We filed for an injunction the next morning, temporary, narrow, clean, asking a judge to freeze enforcement until the association regained standing or the court said otherwise. I put on a suit I save for days when I need the fabric to do some of the talking, and I told the truth under oath with my hands still and my throat dry. Marla's lawyer tried clerical so hard he stripped the threads. He tried disgruntled, like a trick you pull from a sleeve. He tried covenants are forever, like a hymn. Evan testified, voice steadier than it had any right to be. The judge looked over the seals and the dates and the minutes, then said in that low, even tone judges have when they're not interested in drama, authority requires authority, and granted the injunction. She tacked on a note about referring certain allegations to the district attorney's office, which I did not expect, and for a beat no one in the room moved. Then the sound came, the kind people make when a weight they didn't admit to carrying rolls off their spine. That night's Cypress Landing felt like its name again. The lake threw back a sky the color of peach ice cream. The geese yelled at no one in particular, and kids drew on the sidewalk without anyone pretending the world would end if chalk met concrete. June crouched, hair in her face, tongue between her teeth, drawing sunflowers so bright I swear they hummed. A girl I didn't know drew a huge wobbly sun. A boy added waves where waves had no business being. Mrs. Patel came down with a folding chair and a thermos, and for the first time since we moved in, she stayed. Evan walked up slow, hands empty for once. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I don't offer absolution, I answered, but I do recognize traction when I see it. He laughed at that first time I'd heard it and nodded toward the clubhouse, where the board's banner drooped like it had lost interest in the room. They're going to refile, he said. They'll try to hold elections and look brand new. I hope they do it in daylight, I said. Sunlight makes quick work of mildew. He smiled, looked like somebody who finally slept. Here's the part that complicates the pretty ending. Not everyone wants the HOA gone. Some folks like rules, like uniform shrubs and matching mailboxes and the promise that nobody on the end of the cul-de-sac is going to paint their garage door teal. I get that. Community isn't freedom from each other. It's friction organized into something that doesn't throw sparks every night. Truth is, those covenants still exist. If the association gets its house in order and stands back up, we'll still need rules, and we'll still argue about kayaks and porch swings and the correct angle of a hedgerow. We'll still need people to show up on Tuesday nights and read the minutes and say, hey no, that's not how we treat each other, before the pot boils. Marla? I haven't seen her in a while. Her blinds stayed shut for a week, and then her card disappeared like a rumor. I heard she hired a PR firm off course she did, and I heard she might sue me for tortious interference. Of course, she might, and I'm not foolish enough to think we want something permanent. People like her don't vanish. They regroup or rebrand, and sometimes they win the next season because normal folks relax and stop watching. But that sidewalk turned into a quilt that night. Chalk dust on everyone's palms, sunflowers and suns, and squiggly waves, and somebody even wrote, welcome, in a blocky blue that looked like hope. June leaned into me and whispered, do we live here now? And I said, we do. And I meant in the full sense, not just inside the mortgage. I don't know what will happen next month. Maybe we'll have a fair election, and maybe we'll fight about where the money went, and maybe the county will nose around the way it should. Maybe we'll dissolve the whole machine and figure out a simpler way to be neighbors that doesn't require laminated nameplates. Or maybe we'll put decent people in those chairs and remember that a rule without a human heart behind it is just furniture. You tell me, what's justice look like in a neighborhood like this? Is it refund checks and resignations and the board starting from zero? Or is it the end of the whole concept because we've all had enough of gated empathy? Should kids be able to draw on a sidewalk without a $500 apology? Or is that one of those lines communities get to draw together on a good day? Drop your take in the comments. What's fair? What's overreach? What's the right balance between order and living a life that still feels like yours? And if you've got a story about an HOA or a bossy neighbor or a paper bully who forgot that authority is borrowed, share it, because sunlight's not just a disinfectant, it's a fuel. And if you're into hearing more real stories told by real people trying to keep their corners of the world honest, hit like, hit subscribe, and pull up a chair next Tuesday. We'll make room.